With Suzanne, our monkey head model, we have our UVs laid out and we're ready to create a texture image, which we can do in the UV image editor down at the bottom, the plus button called New, also in the image menu, New Image, or the hotkey Alt-N. So let's click that and we get a menu where we can name the texture that we're about to create. I'll simply call this texture. And next we have our width and height resolution. 1024 by 1024 is fine. Traditionally, textures are created as perfect squares, so these dimensions are the same, but you can make these values whatever you want. Of course, the higher the value, the more clear your image will be, but the more memory it will consume as well. And then we have the color, which is the color that our entire image will be when we create it. Black is fine. Do we want an alpha or not? That's dependent on your situation. And now the generated type is by default set to blank, which means the color, but we also have the option to do a color grid or a UV grid. And I personally like to start with the UV grid, and I'll show you why. We'll click that. No need for 32-bit float right now. Click OK. And our UV image editor will automatically adjust to the size of the texture that we created. And that is how you create an image texture. But how do we see that on the model? This is actually one of the more convoluted things about Blender in my opinion, because it's different depending on if we're using Blender Render up here as the engine or we're using Cycles Render. So I'll show you both ways real quick. With Blender Render in object mode, all I have to do is jump down here to Viewport Shading and choose Texture. And you'll see our texture is on the model, but there is some lighting information thanks to the lamp that's in the scene. So I can either delete the lamp, or if I don't want to delete the lamp, I can open up my view properties with the N key. And in the shading drop down, I can enable shadeless. And now we can see our pure texture information applied to the model, no shading or lighting information. And so the point of the checker texture is that in addition to the UV stretching visualization that you saw in the last lesson, this texture pattern is useful for identifying UV stretching. Because according to my image texture, all these squares are exactly the same size. However, on my model, we can see that they vary. And so particularly on this eyebrow portion, the squares are much bigger than they are, say, around this UV seam, which is something also that becomes noticeable due to this texture, because we can see that it doesn't line up on this half with the texture on the other half. So going back to the art of unwrapping, you want to be mindful of where you put these seams, because ultimately you don't want them to be visible. But anyway, back to the checker texture, a way that we can use it to adjust our UVs and to better judge how our UVs are laid out is I can tab into edit mode. And remember, the brow area is having our stretching, which is confirmed by the yellow and orange faces that we see in our UV area stretching visualization. And so I can select those areas with our C circle select tool. Let's select one brow at a time. And then when I scale this up with the S key, you'll see that the color shifts from yellow to green and from orange eventually to greenish blue. So by scaling this up, this particular area of the mesh is gaining what's called texel density. And so tabbing back into object mode, we now see that our squares on this brow are a little bit closer in size to the rest of our surface, but that's at the cost of the stretching that we see here. So again, this goes back to the art of UV layout and how it's a balancing act between stretching and cutting new seams. But ultimately, that's not the point of this lesson. I just wanted to show you how the checker texture is useful. And the last thing that I want to show you is how this is different with the Cycles engine, at least viewing the texture on the model in the 3D view. So if I switch over to the Cycles engine, you'll see that my model is white, despite the fact that nothing changed in terms of my image being assigned to the UVs. Because if you remember in Blender Render, when I created the image, I was tabbed into edit mode and I had all of my mesh faces selected. Whereas if I remove this checker texture, our model goes back to white, just like Cycles. And if I deselect everything and choose that image texture again, nothing happens. I have to have all of my mesh components selected. So I can box select around my UVs and then select our checker texture. And that is what will assign it to the model in the 3D view. That is how Blender Render works. Back to Cycles, it doesn't work this way, even though the image is assigned to the UVs. Instead, it's based on the node editor. So instead of the UV image editor, let's jump over to the node editor. And with my monkey selected, I have to add a new material. And then with the hotkey Shift A, add a texture, image texture node. This is where I can select our texture, and with this node selected, the texture will display in our viewport. If I have another image texture in here, it will display that image. And so that is how it works with cycles. And even though I breezed through the node editor in this lesson, we will be covering it in depth later in the shading course. So the point of this lesson was to show how to create an image texture and display it on our model in the 3D view. Next, we'll look at Blender's texture painting features.